tape here.
All right, rolling out.
All right. So I guess we can start with some of the basics.
What are the basics?
You mean act like I'm drawing?
What's that?
You mean act like I'm drawing?
No.
No.
Should I sit in the chair? Every time I move this chair, it's going to make a big noise. You hear it?
Just, yeah.
Okay.
So how long have you been doing Vic and Natalie?
Well, for some time now, about 8 years or so, and the origins. Oh wait, let's start this over again. I was thinking about cartoons. I was Vic and Natalie.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
It's cartoons.
Talk about cartoons. Yeah.
Okay.
Just basically trying to get the
Yeah.
thing.
I've been drawing New Orleans cartoons with New Orleans dialect for about 8 years or so. And the origins were when I was working for the newspaper Figaro, the weekly newspaper, which is now defunct. And it was suggested that it would be humorous to do cartoons based on conversations of Orleanians. And so I did one. The very first one took place at the Jazz Festival because it was going to come out in April or May, I remember. And it was people standing in line to get beer, having a conversation. I thought that was a typical New Orleans thing. And it was somebody, a girl who lived across the river and had to go all the way across the river and to get home that evening, and she was complaining because Larry, her boyfriend or something, had already gone across the river twice that day and said he wouldn't go over the river 3 times. And that was too much. So that was the first cartoon, and I just started doing them, and they became popular.
Are you from New Orleans originally?
Mm-hmm. And I was raised in Metairie, Airline Park subdivision, and Lynn Park subdivision.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? Well, it means that I wasn't raised in New Orleans proper, so it did make a difference because living in Metairie then was kind of like living in the rest of America. Not exactly, because New Orleans was kind of exotic, and the way people talked, everything about them was unusual to me because I was from a Protestant family, and everybody else was Catholic around us, and all the kids were Catholic and talking about saints and Stations of the Cross and all this stuff when you're little. So it was a pretty weird place to grow up in. But since I was, my parents are from North Louisiana, and it's just different because that's like the Bible Belt or something. So it was different than really being from New Orleans, even though I lived here all my life. So it gave me I could see all these people differently, gave me an appreciation of them.
So you're saying you could see the people from New Orleans proper who spoke in a different dialect from the way you spoke.
Right.
Do you remember how you discovered that? I mean,
well, I remember I guess my earliest memories are going to school. I rode the school bus. I guess starting in junior high school, I stopped riding my bicycle because it wasn't cool anymore. And all these girls that I was always enamored with, usually Italian girls, and the equivalent is like greasers or something nowadays. And they were bad, and they had teased hair, looked like punks look nowadays. And I was just always in love with these girls, but I never could even talk to them because they were unapproachable, and they sat in the back of the bus and smoked cigarettes. And talked in what people call YEAH dialect. I don't like that word that much, but that kind of stuff, with D's and does and dems. And so I guess it's become this fetish with me, these unusual looking women that talk really bad.
an interesting motivation.
But you find
That's the best kind of motivation.
you can find, but I remember it's really true when I was young, and you'll see them downtown or something, they're fairly attractive, and they open their mouths, and it's like, ooh, pretty strong.
Yeah, well, that's what some of the people we talked to, they said people all the time, they say, you'd just be beautiful if you kept your mouth closed.
Mm-hmm. But it's not bad. I read an article years ago about these girls from London who were Cockneys, who really had the accent, would leave London, go to New York and get the highest paid salaries of any receptionist or secretary because they are quaint or nice or whatever. But in England, they couldn't get a job because they were like lower class. So New Orleans accent appealing, I don't know.
But there must be something. I mean, you've had quite a success. I don't know whether you just fell into it or whatever, but you've had quite a success with cartoons which specifically relate to New Orleans dialect. So there must be some sort of interest.
a great interest, and also I think it's a pretty unique thing, and you know, bizarre. That always appeals to me, just the way people come up with such astounding malapropisms or whatever, you know, just weird words or mispronunciations. You know, I just developed an interest in it probably early in my life, and I got a good ear for it, I think.
How do you refine it? I mean, you do a strip a week, at least.
Yeah, well, one of the refinements was learning to write it down so people would catch it, you know, and to do it kind of phonetically, I guess. Because people have been doing dialogues like this, or this kind of dialect, for, you know, quite some time. It's very similar to Brooklynese, I think. And, you know, people have always, in cartoons, Cats and Jammer Kids or whatever, done dialect things. But there never has been one about New Orleans, I don't think, specifically. And I just thought it was a good idea. I liked it.
So would you say most of, let me change tips. Well, you went through a metamorphosis. I mean, you started with For Sure, which ran for I don't know how many years in Figaro.
Like 5 years or so.
Okay, can you just very briefly tell us what For Sure was, what the concept was behind that?
Well, For Sure were cartoons based on things that I actually heard or that people heard, would tell me. People would send them in the mail. They were usually something I heard, though, myself. And I would just go around to places in the city, or just whatever I was doing during the course of the day. I would hear things, and I would write them down or remember them. But those are true to that thesis, that I would actually hear the things. And then I started working for the Times-Picayune, for Dixie magazine, they wanted me to do cartoons. Jeanette Hardy, the editor, when she first became editor, she called me and wanted me to do something. But she didn't want it to be like what I did before. She wanted some new idea, and I wanted to do something new too. I was kind of tired of doing that, because it was, you had to kind of strain too much to do it sometimes, you know, like I'd have to, because I really wanted to remain true to that thing. So I'd go out on Friday night or whatever and try really hard to hear something funny. And you usually hear something funny here on Friday night, but it's easier to sit at home and think them up. Or just, after a while, after being in New Orleans all your life, you have a kind of wealth of this stuff inside your head, and you can just do it, or I can, I think. So I devised this idea for Jeanette Hardy of doing this couple, Vic and Natalie, and their names are Vic and Natalie Broussard. And they would own a Ninth Ward bar, restaurant, typical neighborhood place in New Orleans. And that way, I thought I could have all kind of people from walks of life and different walks of life and tourists and whatever come into the place and have conversations between Vic and Natalie and their customers. They had a little Chihuahua who resides in a coffee cup, and his name is Tootsie. And lately I've introduced this character named Rex the Roach, so that the Chihuahua and the Roach can carry on and talk about things. So that was the original idea, and so after I did a few of these Ninth Ward type cartoons, Jeanette said that she thought I should have some uptowners or something come in. So I said, all right. So I wanted to have these people at Mardi Gras, like an uptown couple, and to me a typical couple for that genre of people would be this unmarried son who was, say, in his 40s, probably a homosexual or something, and his 80-year-old mother who would be in a mink coat and all these jewels. And they would have gone to a Mardi Gras ball, and after the ball they'd go to Vic and Natalie's to get something to eat. And so I thought that'd be pretty funny. So anyway, I had the name for the people. Their name was going to be the Westfelds. So I did this cartoon, and the guy's first name was Westfeld even. It wasn't his last name. And I went in, I came home, and they called me from the paper and said, oh, you can't do this, you can't have a Westfeld in there. And you know, I didn't even realize that there was this uptown social family named Westfeld in New Orleans. So I thought it wasn't a big deal, but I had to go down there, and I brought a copy of the social register so I wouldn't copy any famous New Orleans names and offend anybody. But it struck me as interesting that you know, you can make fun of people in the Ninth Ward or whatever, but you don't make fun of people uptown, maybe. But
well, do you think you're making fun of the people in the Ninth Ward?
I don't think that I am, really. I think I'm maybe celebrating them. But you know, whenever I've been around these people, you know, and told them who I was, you know, and showed them things that I do. They always think it's funny, you know. But I guess it shows you maybe about uptown people can't laugh at themselves, maybe. I don't think they're very funny anyway. You know, so I prefer not to do cartoons about them, to tell you the truth, because they all kind of, you know, clones of each other.
Your stuff to people there? I mean, how do they react to it?
They just they can, well, you know, my stuff, people, nowadays, you know, a lot of people in New Orleans are familiar with it because in the Sunday paper, a lot of people read the paper. So if I can just say I do those cartoons in the Sunday paper, they know who I am. But in Figaro, which didn't have the circulation of the Sunday paper, you know, I would show them a cartoon and they would look at it and they would read it. And so I think people enjoy sitting down and reading these things and reading it to each other. And, you know, I go around like on Sunday morning somewhere and see people reading Sunday paper and reading them. And they get it all wrong, you know, and read it totally incorrect, but they have fun doing it and they try to, you know, read it right. So that's good. It makes me feel good that I make all these people amused on Sunday morning after a rough.
Have you ever received any negative criticism from the class of people that you describe?
Well, I've received not too much negative criticism really. I received a letter at the Times-Picayune. Last summer I did a cartoon of Vic and it was his nephew who was trying out for Vic's annual 4th of July crab boil and party or whatever. And the nephew is like a real Mattery type heavy metal punk teenager kid. And you know, he has all these amplifiers 10 feet high all around him. And you know, the kid is asking Vic, you know, what kind of music does he want to hear, punk or new wave or heavy metal? He goes through all these different forms of music. And Vic asked him, you don't know how to play the Saints? Which is probably all that matters for a party like that. But for some reason, that cartoon upset some reader. It was a woman, I believe, wrote in a letter, of course, assumed that I was a woman as usual, and said, where does this woman live in New Orleans to see people like this? This is disgusting. You know, what neighborhood is she from? And I just thought, you know, when I see stuff like that, I go out and really...
That's something that, I mean, we're going to face it with this show too. You want everyone to laugh at it, but you don't want to play into their hands and have the thing be a big put down.
Yeah, I mean, I could do really satirical, nasty cartoons about uptown people if I wanted to, I think. But I don't even care about it, you know. To me, it's a lost cause. But the Ninth Ward people, you know, I see them as, and Ninth Ward is really a generalized term that I use all the time, because, I mean, these people live just as much in Mattery or Chalmette as the Ninth Ward, really. And they're just kind of like, I guess you'd say, the native New Orleanians of Italian or French background, mostly Italian. But, you know, I just think that they are the ones that really preserve the spirit of New Orleans, you know. They're the ones that have all these marching clubs and that have all the neighborhood bars and the truck floats and stuff. And that's, to me, really the soul of New Orleans, just as much, you know, I think people here, you know, the black people are given a lot of credit for all of the culture in New Orleans, but these people contribute just as much, you know, and they're worthy of just as much, you know, interest, I think. Because, you know, I see people all the time coming from New York or Massachusetts or whatever, England or Norway, and they want to, you know, they go crazy over New Orleans blacks, like, you know, like they're the first white people ever to see this, but the New Orleans white people are just as funky, really.
They
just
seem
as
also to share a lot of the same.
They do share a lot, you know, and a lot of people now, people like my generation, say 20 to 30, probably were all raised in Jefferson Parish, the suburbs, but the generations before that were all raised in New Orleans before the Great White Flight, you know, and they're like black people in a lot of ways because they live next door to each other, you know, it's not so different. Especially the lower middle class or whatever, pretty much gel.
Yeah, we have a lot of footage of, like, you know, some Italians and some Irish second lining and getting down, and it's really remarkable, the duplication. You see blacks and whites, same thing.
I would think, you know, that your true New Orleanian, it's very, you know, hard to distinguish what race they are, really. They are like gumbo or something, you know, they're a pretty good mix of people here, blood.
Yeah, you don't usually have too many black characters in your strip.
Yeah, sometimes, but not, because that would be like a cheap shot in a way sometimes. I think that I could do, maybe in a while, I think about that a lot, that I should have black characters and black people in there. But in the state of our society nowadays, that it would just be used to ridicule them, really. You know, I could have black people talking like they talk. And when I do interviews, I try to convey that, you know, for newspaper writing things. But in cartoons, it kind of makes me, you know, I wouldn't feel bad about it, really. I mean, I could have people saying, hey, I'm a nigger or whatever. It wouldn't bother me, but the newspaper would cause problems. It's a sensitive thing. Because I think, and probably when I do a Vic and Natalie book, I'm going to have some real unexpurgated cartoons, probably. Because really, you know, people that are like Vic in a bar, they would be talking about niggers all the time. They'd be talking about assholes and all this kind of stuff. And I probably should do that to make it really true. But I'll have to see.
Yeah, the characters are really, I mean, they're very benevolent, you know, as they come across in the paper.
Yeah, I try to make Vic pretty sarcastic, you know, or kind of, you know, because as I wrote one time, you know, if he's a typical New Orleans bartender or whatever, he's basically a pretty lazy person. And this is almost as good as not working to run a bar, because you can kind of stay kind of loaded all day, you know, and you don't have to do too much. And you have a lot of these kind of bars in New Orleans where these guys don't really want too much business. They kind of want it to level it is, so it'll pay the bills. They don't want to attract a lot of interest or anything, because then it'd be work. And so this way, you know, they can do things on the side, I guess, like be bookies and stuff. You know, I've often thought about having Vic have like a bookie joint in the back of his bar. You know, that would be good.
Where do you get the ideas for, you know, that he has a crab boil on July 4th, or that
well, I try to,
hour or whatever?
yeah. Well, I try to think of, I do these cartoons, say, a month in advance, so I have to kind of think all the time in the future what holidays are coming up or what, because I want to tie it in with all the customs and celebrations in New Orleans, and I think that'll make the cartoons better. And then I feel when I have a book come out, then the whole little thing together will be a whole deal about the city. So as for ideas, I guess, you know, I think, say for the crab boil at 4th of July, your typical Americans would have a weenie roast or something, but in New Orleans, I think we should have a crab boil, you know, and
what are some of the things that Vic and Natalie did during the year 1982, which would characterize New Orleanians?
the year 82, well,
Or just, you know, since, you know,
they do a lot of stuff like, Vic is in some organization which has a truck float, and he was, you know, mad at one point because he wasn't elected King Mosquito, I think it was, because there were all going to be mosquitoes in the float, and he sat around and sulked and was, you know, pissed off and everything all the time. And then this year, he got the idea that, I guess he went kind of insane or something, that that the School of Design, which is the front organization for Rex, was going to make him Rex. And that was just me kind of being bizarre. Hello? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, I'm talking to some guys right now. I got to go.
just, no, go ahead, were you gonna say?
Well, go ahead. Continue the line.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you, just, you know, a couple other examples of what Vic and Natalie might do, which makes them.
Well, one thing that Vic did this year, which he'd never done before, he went to his first and only Mardi Gras ball, and they had him he was up in the balcony of the ball, and he had a rented tuxedo on and everything, and it was stiff and all that business. And he said, Natalie, I don't understand this, you know, the whole idea of a bunch of little girls tap dancing and a bunch of guys dressed up like, you know, jesters or whatever they were, clowns. And Natalie says, Vic, this is culture, which is what people in New Orleans think Mardi Gras balls are, but personally I find them pretty boring. I don't see what the big deal is. And that's the kind of thing, like a guy like Vic, he wouldn't particularly love to go to Mardi Gras balls or something. His wife would want to go. And then Natalie is like you know, gossip and everything, always in the phone, yakking all the time. And
One of the things we're trying to get at is what are the things which separate Vic and Natalie from other, you know, say if there was somebody doing this in Minneapolis, what's the difference between that and here? And what sources do you have to draw from here, which you don't have there or anywhere else for that matter?
Well, I'll kind of think, okay, we have Vic and Natalie, or Vic and his customers will be discussing, say, from August on about hurricanes and you know, if a big one ever hit here, which is always a source of enjoyment in bars, I find. Just the thing about talking about disasters in New Orleans, people are really into that. Cancer, you know, all these really bad things. They love to hear that somebody, you know, just got in a wreck and broke all their arms and legs, you know, might be dying. And, you know, that if a hurricane might be coming here, if it hits New Orleans directly, the levee will break and the city will flood, you know, and all these things are very interesting to people here. And I don't know whether in all cities it's like that. I don't know why we're like that here. But I guess, I think probably maybe it's a genetic thing from being around all these big bodies of water and having poisonous water to drink and bad air.
Mediterranean thing too.
Yeah.
Several Mediterranean.
And it's a very Italian, I guess, you know, it reminds me of Italian movies. I don't know what Italy's like, but New Orleans reminds me of that.
Where do you go do you go places in New Orleans for inspiration?
Yes.
Dialogue.
I go to the various Schwagmans a lot. And those are constant source of material, really. I could go in there with a tape recorder and just get stuff forever. And I like the one on Airline Highway because the manager or something there, his name is Mr. Something Matthews or something, Mr. Matthews White. And they constantly say his name while I'm in there, and it's always like a jolt of walking around, you know, like you hear Matthews all the time. But those are real good places. K&B is good. Any kind of like bars and stuff. I like, I have some bars I like Caronex in the Ninth Ward. There's a couple of them. The Caronex by St. Roch Mark is pretty.
What kind of stuff do you listen for?
Just anything, just to what people are talking about. Because there'll always be a kind of typical New Orleans viewpoint on it, it seems like. And they talk about, I guess they talk about things that everybody else in the rest of the country talks about, but they also talk about food a lot. And Saints losing all the time, and just disasters all the time.
Do you ever do imitations? I mean, it seems to me you capture the dialect pretty well.
To talk that way?
Yeah, do you ever talk that way?
No. I think I do talk that way sometimes without thinking about it, because it's probably, you know, I think probably when I was little, I thought these people sounded stupid. But now being here so long, that it creeps in. I know I say duh all the time, and I say nuh-uh, which is a New Orleans thing. It's a New Orleans thing to say, yeah, nuh-uh, yeah, and it's like you're affirming and unaffirming yourself all the time.
Why don't you like the term "yat"?
Because, you know, I never heard that term until I left New Orleans when I was about 19 and lived in, or 20, and lived in Rhode Island for a couple of years. And some guy one day said, what's a yat like you do in Rhode Island? And I never really had heard it. And probably being in Metairie, it's really an uptown thing, I think. And people uptown use that term. And I just kind of, I think it's like saying nigger. You know, it's kind of, I don't think it's too nice to say it.
So who do you think uses words like that?
People that have BMWs and are lawyers.
But recently, stereotype on its ear there.
Yeah, really. We got that one, right?
It's really biased.
Why can't painless, I thought.
I'm driving for BMW. I don't profess at that. I won't read the stuff. But recently, it seems to me.
Recently, yeah, I'll tell you. Recently, for some reason, and maybe it's due to me. Well, it's due to two things: me, and that Confederacy of Dunce's book, which I have to say I never have read yet, because I thought it might be bad for me to read it. And because when it came out, so many people hit me up all the time and say, hey, this book's out, it's just like what you do. And that kind of offended me. And so then somebody gave me a copy, I read a few pages, and I didn't like it. You know, I didn't want to read it. So I was just glad the guy killed himself and was out of the way. And so,
Well.
and so, but anyway, I think since the popularity of the cartoons I do in that book, there has been a consciousness of this kind of yat thing, and now there's a I see all kind of yes that there were commercials for time saver these people did, which were kind of good sometimes, but kind of bad a lot of times, I think. One thing I thought, one day I was driving around in my car listening to radio, and these guys run some AM radio talk show, and they were 3 local guys, all named, you know, Boudreaux or whatever, and they were going to start doing commercials in what they called YEAH Dialect, and these guys were really, you know, New Orleans guys, and they talk like this normally, and then they tried to do it, and it was corny, you know. So they didn't even realize that this is the way they talk, which is, you know, pretty bad.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that the time saver commercials and your cartoons too, I think, another extent, it has caused a certain amount of self-reflection. You know, is that I think 10 years ago there wasn't that much consciousness of dialect.
No, I don't think it was at all, really. People just, but now it really is. You know, I see all this. There's going to be YEAH T-shirts soon and everything, I think.
There's a radio station, YEAH.
Yeah, I know that.
YEAH Radio.
I know.
And so it's kind of it's an interesting inversion, because we've been interviewing people and we'll say, do you think you have an accent? Oh yeah, well we talk everybody in the channel talks this way, you know. And I don't think they would have said that 10 years ago.
I think before they might have denied it, really, and just because it was considered, you know, lower class. I mean, I think it is still considered lower class to be that way, but now it's funny, I guess. It's gonna be like, well, it won't be like Valley Girls, but it's the same sort of phenomena.
Well, it's also certain pride.
Yeah.
I know. I think there's
Yeah, I guess so.
a
Yeah.
Pride in being different.
And people in New Orleans would take pride in it. They take pride in being fat and stupid.
Yeah. So, anything else you want to know?
The only other thing I want to ask people from out of town have that same kind of reaction when they first see them.
One instance, a vivid one, is riding on the subway in Boston one day about, I guess, 1979 or so, and I had a copy of my book, which came out in '78, and there was this young girl there, and I was showing it to her, and she was in high school or something, and she was looking at it. And people in Boston should catch on, really, because some of them talk this way too. And she was reading it, and she really didn't catch on. She was laughing politely, but it didn't make sense. And I don't, you know, I just always assume everybody will be able to read it and understand it, and I guess it is difficult for foreigners. But then I think after they catch on, it's a big gas for them. And people I find that really like it a lot are people that either were from New Orleans and moved to New York or somewhere, you know, and they're real homesick all the time, or else they lived here for a few years and really got a heavy dose of New Orleans culture, and so like I remind them of it, and they can, you know, you can't really go somewhere and convey to people the way New Orleans people talk, and which is the way they are. And I think if you show them my cartoons, it gives them some idea. Because the people don't really believe how, you know, weird it really is here. I think people really are different than anywhere else.
Well, after a while, it gets to be kind of a code, you know. I mean, just even looking through the year of '83 here, and it's like the talk of lucky beans and doubloons, and there are lots of words and expressions which are really not clear to people outside of.
But I want it to be like that. I want it to be hard in a way. I mean, they should have to figure it out. I don't want to, you know. Yeah, I think I could do so-called yaddy cartoons, make them real simple and stupid and easy, but I think people should, you know, get into it enough where they'll try to figure it out. And if they don't have that much knowledge in New Orleans, well then, too bad. Because I've always been kind of, you know, xenophobic. I don't, you know, trust outsiders or anything. And I don't really care about selling New Orleans off piecemeal to the rest of the world. I don't like that idea. I've always been content to be local, you know, and just hang around here.
Well, what does make New Orleans different in your eyes?
I think the biggest thing is the attitude, the people and their values. Just, I think to have a good time is the main value. You know, real sensual place, I think. And food and getting loaded and all these things are more important than making an appointment. You know, if you have an appointment to go somewhere and meet somebody at 3 o'clock and somebody offers you, you know, go drink beer and have po' boy, well, you can probably blow off the appointment. And in the rest of puritanical America, you know, people don't do stuff like that really. You might do it once and be really sad about it, but here, you know, who cares? It's really a c'est la vie attitude here, I think. And I like that. I think that, you know, it's a good attitude for the world nowadays. Because since we're all living on the brink of disaster, you might as well, you know, not care about anything.
Have a good time while you're doing it.
Yeah.
Do you ever worry that by writing this stuff down, you're changing it? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Well, you change it, and I think it's all in the interpretation of the reader, how they read it. And if they're, like I said, from New Orleans, they understand the dialect and the culture well, they can just use what I do as a source point, because they'll just look at it and just glance over and it'll be funny, because they'll understand. And then for other people, I think writing is good because I'll help preserve it in a way. Because I don't know, I don't know whether this will ever die out the way people talk. I don't think it will, really, as long as we have public schools and, these people here.
I mean, it's one of the things that we feel like when we go off and film Indians, for example, Mardi Gras Indians, that we're kind of presiding over, at the same time we're preserving, but we're also destroying it a little bit by bringing in, exposing it to the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And you're kind of doing the same thing. And I was wondering, if you ever felt it.
But also, I think that the kind of thing like Vic and Natalie's bar, like sometimes I don't even know whether it should be set in the 1980s, because this really might already be gone, these kind of places. There's some left, maybe a great deal left, but not that many. And I think these kind of places might not be there forever. I don't know, but to me that's what's good about New Orleans, that maybe the people here are so into this that it will last, where it doesn't last in other cities, our peculiarities and our ethnicities. And but when I'm, showing these kind of people, there aren't that many places in the Ninth Ward left like this, really, because the Ninth Ward's, a lot of it's black now. And people like Vic and Natalie probably would have moved to the suburbs in the 60s. Because I know numerous instances of people that tell me that, Vic and Natalie is just like this bar on the corner when I was a kid, or when my father was a kid in the Ninth Ward. But now not many of these people live there at all, really.
But a few do. I mean, it's just a lot.
A few do, but
Yeah.
it's changing a lot, and then parts of the Ninth Ward, for instance, are like Bywater. I mean, it's chic, now.
Uptown, yeah.
It's uptown. But then the other side of St. Claude, on the left-hand side, the lake side, is pretty heavy duty. So.
Yeah, the interesting thing is we're going to change it.
The side changes all the time, but that's why. See, I always say Ninth Ward, but that's a really generalized term, because the Ninth Ward is all over; it's everywhere, and the people really are in Metairie or Chalmette just as much. That's probably, maybe Vic and Natalie should be in Metairie. Maybe I'll have them move out there to a new location, and have some bizarre architectural design or something. Because these kind of people would be like that, I had this idea for a bar once. I was thinking about there would be just all doubloons inside, like just have all the walls covered with doubloons, and it'd be like a whole doubloon theme. That'd be pretty good for New Orleans.
Yeah, a real bar, or a bar for the ineffective.
Or for them, maybe. Well,
Base these characteristics on any real person.
Well, the mustache, for instance, that Vic has is kind of the classic Italian gangster type little pencil-thin mustache, which Vic Schiro, the former mayor of New Orleans, had or has. And because of the way he looked and the way he talked and who he was an actor in B movies, and but I think Vic and Natalie just reflect the diet of the area.
Well, neither of them were very healthy, but certainly not Vic.
Well, if you work in a bar all the time in a pretty unhealthy place.
So what sort of a background are you going to give them when you do your book? I mean, you're going to...
Well, I want to say where he was born and where he grew up and all that kind of stuff. But I've got to figure it out first.
Do you have any ideas?
Yeah. I mean, I want him to have been born somewhere like Hotel Dieu or something. I got to make sure these places were in existence when he would have been born. But that he went to, Catholic school in New Orleans, and was raised by the nuns and the priests and everything. I think it has a big influence in the way these people are, or values and stuff. And then might change too, you know, because you don't have all the nuns nowadays in the schools. And
Do you know personally people like Vic and Natalie?
oh yeah, and you know, people like at seafood places I go to, or I have friends that talk this way. I don't want to name any names, but they, for better or for worse, right, better for worse, this is the way they are. And you know, I like them. What?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, you enjoy, you know.
But yeah, some of the most wonderful experiences of my life have been like going to a St. Joseph's Day luncheon that a friend of mine had from a distinguished Chalmette Italian family. And, you know, they're pretty neat. I feel like an outsider all the time, to tell you the truth. Even when I go into, you know, I don't like these people that come to New Orleans and get gung-ho and go into bars all over the city and trying to be cool and act like they fit in, because you don't really ever fit in. And I think it's very important if you do stuff like this or anything in New Orleans, if you're going to go around and examine the culture, you should try to be as invisible as possible. And, you know, a lot of people go out and they blow it for everybody else really by acting foolish.
I know Andy and I were talking the other day about the progression of you know, perceptions about dialects. Is first you started off with the time saver commercials, which is to a certain degree exploiting the dialect for a commercial reason.
You want to put your hand down, Lou?
Yeah.
Okay.
And do you ever worry about that?
Yeah, I do, and I would idea of doing Vic and Natalie T-shirts, for instance, or tote bags, or go whatever. But I'm probably one day, and probably soon, I'll be confronted with that possibility about how commercial I want to take it. But then, if I don't do it, somebody else will probably do it, and it'll be worse. So it might as well be me that gets the swimming pool and the BMW.
Better watch out for them.
But no, but I don't. You know, when I saw those time saver commercials, I didn't like that. They're probably lying.
No, they have some guy who tells them about, you know, people being buried in like in Greenwood Cemetery. This is something that these people would have, so then they would write that into their dialogue.
Did you ask him about me?
No. Why? Have you had run-ins with them?
No, I just wondered what they, you know, they thought they were bark.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, all the people we talked to who live in the Irish Channel, the Ninth Ward, they all brought up so they don't give you too much interference, apart from not letting you use the names of real socialites in that Dixie.
Oh no. They don't say anything really. I just go drop cartoons off, never even talk to them usually.
Basically, I never used to read the damn magazine.
Yeah,
At least I read it.
Oh, it's improved a lot,
There was
yeah.
an appalling story they did about some debutante going to Amherst or something. Remember that?
Yeah.
About 3 months ago.
The worst story.
But she does some pretty good stuff, really, by and large. Bandstand name, I thought of the backbeat name after having to explain to him what a backbeat was. And then also, you know, I said, you know, backbeat would be like a, you know, a beat, you know, like you have a beat when you're a reporter, you know, backbeat, get it?
What are these? Do you know what these characters are going to say?
Well, I think she's gonna say, this is good, what is this? And she's gonna say, meatloaf gumbo. Something like that, some ridiculous food item. I think meatloaf gumbo would be good.
What's the Chihuahua going to say?
I don't know. I was thinking something, I don't know. Like humans will eat anything. Or it sounds like dog food to me. I can't make them too gross because Jenny does have this idea that Sunday morning and people are getting ready to go to church and everything and reading this. When I've done things that are kind of blue in a way, like she doesn't like that too much if it's about pornography or something.
Give the boy a chance. Say it.
Okay, back in the 1940s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was President of the United States, he paid a spate.
Hey, don't make it sound like it's staged.
Okay.
You're giving us a lecture. You
Okay.
know that story about the...
Okay. Well, back in the 1940s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was President of the United States, he paid a state visit to New Orleans. And of course, he was brought to Antoine's for a dinner with all the city dignitaries. And the mayor of New Orleans at the time was Mayor Maestri. And in the midst of the dinner, he leaned over to President Roosevelt and said, "How you like them oysters, Cap?" And President Roosevelt's reaction is not recorded.
The thing that
Okay, back in the 1940s, President Roosevelt paid a state visit to New Orleans, and he was taken all over the city by Mayor Maestri, who didn't have very much to say, just was a calm, collected tour guide. But in the end of the evening, they went to Antoine's for a dinner, and after the whole day of not saying too much, Maestri leaned over to President Roosevelt and said, "How you like them oysters, Cap?"
Matthews, take 3.
Yeah, really. This is the best so far.
Yeah.
You probably heard the story before about when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was President of the United States at the time, came to New Orleans for a state visit, and he was taken all over town by Mayor Maestri, who was not probably the most educated of men. And Maestri really didn't have very much at all to say to Roosevelt. And then in the evening, they went to Antoine's for dinner, and Maestri had stayed pretty mum during the dinner, and then he turned to Roosevelt and said, "How you like them oysters, Cap?" And then Roosevelt, I'm not sure what he said. wait.
I like it better this way. This is Matthews, take 4. Maestri story.
Okay, bring in the oysters.
Of course, Roosevelt was a very refined, cultured man, but Maestri was proud to be a New Orleanian and talk like it.
You got to tell the whole story then.
All right.
We can't just use the tag.
All right. Tell the whole story again?
Yeah, then you have to use that.
All right. Long ago in the 1940s, Franklin...
The way you started the other
Okay.
one was fine, the third take. You
Yeah.
probably heard this story. This is a real
Okay.
story.
Yeah, good.
You probably heard the story before about Franklin Delano Roosevelt coming to New Orleans in the 40s when he was President of the United States. And he was taken on a state visit, taken on the grand tour of the city by Mayor Robert Maestri, who really didn't have much to say to the urbane, cultured Roosevelt. And Mr. Maestri, of course, was a man of the people and talked like it. And but he kept pretty mum while Roosevelt was here. And then that evening they went to dinner at Antoine's, and Maestri leaned over to Roosevelt and said, "How you like them oysters, Cap?" Well, Roosevelt didn't have much to say, being such a civilized person, but Maestri talked like he was from here, and he was proud of it.